On July 20th, 1969, the world woke up to the news of the United States achievement, specifically the three astronauts who embarked on the Apollo 11 mission: Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and Neil Armstrong. This event caused a massive global uproar, and America cemented its dominance in the space race, especially since following Apollo 11, several manned missions to the moon were launched. But the strange thing is that, from that time until today, all human missions to the moon have completely stopped. This in turn has raised a series of questions. Why, despite all the scientific progress we're experiencing today, has no one returned to the moon? Especially since the technology and equipment available now would surely make the task much easier than it was back then. Welcome to our channel, Wonders of Secrets. But before we begin, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to receive our videos as soon as they are released. To understand why no manned missions have been launched to the moon since 1972, we first need to know why the Americans decided to travel to the moon in the first place. Was it for scientific research or to benefit humanity, for example? In reality, the answer is no. The primary motive that drove America to send humans to the moon was to prove its superiority over the Soviet Union in front of the entire world. After World War II ended, all parties emerged completely exhausted from the war. Naturally, the economic situation was dire, except for two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union. Because of this, these two nations were constantly vying for global dominance and absolute supremacy. Since they had been allies during the war and had treaties and agreements between them, it was unthinkable for them to engage in direct military conflict. This led to the concept of the Cold War, where each nation sought to prove its superiority in every field over the other. One of these fields was the space race. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik 1 satellite, which orbited Earth in a low orbit for about 3 months. This was the first artificial satellite in human history. A monumental event proved the Soviets were technologically superior to the rest of the world. Just 1 month later, in November of the same year, they placed a dog named Laika in a spacecraft, which also orbited Earth, equipped with sensors to measure her heartbeat, blood pressure, and other vitals. The goal was to study the effects of the space environment on living creatures. Then in 1959, they sent an unmanned probe called Luna 3 to photograph the far side of the moon, which we never see from Earth due to a phenomenon called tidal locking. 2 years later, in April 1961, the Soviets placed a man, pilot Yuri Gagarin, inside a spacecraft, making him orbit Earth for about 100 minutes, becoming the first human ever sent to space. While the US had some achievements in the space race at the time, like launching satellites and sending a chimpanzee to orbit Earth, the overall picture clearly showed the Soviet Union's overwhelming dominance. America was in a very weak position and needed to do something impactful. These Soviet achievements coincided with the start of a new presidential term for U.S. President John F. Kennedy. The man had barely been in office for 3 months, and he was not looking good in front of his people or the rest of the world. This was especially true since Kennedy had already embarrassed the U.S. in front of the Soviets by authorizing an invasion of Cuba to support the opposition against the communists there, an operation that completely failed. Because of this, Kennedy and the Americans needed something big to restore their confidence and the world's trust in them. This led to Kennedy's famous speech on September 12, 1962, where he said, "We choose to go to the moon. We will send a man to the moon and bring him back safely to Earth." He asked the government to support NASA with all the funds and equipment needed to achieve this goal before 1970. Here's the crux of the matter. The Apollo mission was a matter of life or death for the Americans. They saw it as the one thing that would restore their prestige in the eyes of the world. For this reason, they were determined to achieve it at any cost, no matter how much money they had to spend. They were willing to endure tough economic conditions as long as the project succeeded. The Apollo mission was literally America's national project. That's why, if we look at NASA's budget in 1965, we find it was 4.3% of the total U.S. federal budget, a staggering figure that made the equivalent of $264 billion in today's money available for the Apollo mission. This, of course, was in addition to political, governmental, and media support. But what does all this have to do with why no one has returned to the moon? First, NASA's budget today represents about 0.5% of the total U.S. budget. In other words, NASA's budget in the 1960s was 9 times larger than it is now. This amount is not sufficient for safe lunar missions. Underline the word safe because we'll come back to it later. At the same time, the United States has long proven its dominance in the space race, and the matter is settled in its favor, especially since the Soviet Union, their fierce competitor, was dismantled in 1991. Therefore, the Americans have no reason to spend enormous sums again to travel to the moon. What would they prove, and to whom? Now, they can spend much less and still achieve great accomplishments. For example, the Apollo mission we talked about cost over $264 billion in today's money, while the James Webb Telescope, launched a few months ago, and which caused a huge global stir, cost $10 billion. And those $10 billion weren't even paid by the U.S. alone. The project was a partnership with 14 countries, including Austria, Belgium, Canada, Germany, and the UK. From a purely economic perspective, sending humans to the moon again is simply not worth it. Let's clarify an important point so people understand. Sending humans to the moon is completely different from sending machines. Since 1972, unmanned missions to the moon have not stopped. Every few years, a country launches probes or machines to the moon. For example, in 2007, Japan launched the Selene probe. A year later, in 2008, India launched the Chandrayaan-1 spacecraft. 5 years later, in 2013, China sent the Chang'e-3 spacecraft, which successfully landed on the moon. 5 years after that, in 2018, they launched Chang'e-4. 2 years later, in 2020, they launched Chang'e-5, which managed to collect samples of lunar rocks and soil and return them to Earth. This means that missions haven't stopped entirely. What has stopped are the missions carrying humans. Missions carrying machines are relatively easy and involve fewer risks. In contrast, missions carrying humans require enormous funds and effort to ensure highly precise safety measures, such as maintaining temperature and pressure inside the spacecraft, protecting humans from radiation, and providing sufficient oxygen, food, and water for the entire duration of the journey, no matter how long it takes. These factors greatly complicate human missions. Even disposing of astronauts' waste inside the spacecraft is a complex matter. Beyond all these precautions, the rocket carrying them could explode, or the spacecraft could malfunction in space. Instead of the mission being a political triumph for the country undertaking it, it could become a disaster and a massive scandal, not to mention the loss of human lives. This actually happened in 1970 during the Apollo 13 mission. The spacecraft's oxygen tank exploded, and there was a problem with the power generators. The 3 astronauts on board were at risk of death. As a result, after the spacecraft reached lunar orbit, the mission was canceled and they didn't land on the moon. They returned to Earth, landing in the Pacific Ocean, and it was a major event at the time. We could do a special episode about this if you're interested. Let us know in the comments. Finally, there's an important point. All space agencies now have a different strategic mindset than before. Space agencies today believe that all the money spent on Apollo missions for individual trips was an inefficient use of funds and technology. In other words, that money could have been used more effectively. Instead of spending all that money to send humans, the Apollo mission planners could have built an entire system to allow human space travel in a way similar to public transportation. A station on Earth, another in space, and rockets or spacecraft capable of traveling back and forth multiple times. With the enormous sums spent on the Apollo project, such a system could have been created. But of course, no one thought of that because their sole focus was beating the Soviet Union as quickly as possible. Now, however, this is what space agencies are aiming for. Private companies like SpaceX are also working on creating spacecraft capable of repeatedly and sustainably transporting humans to space and back. That's it. We're done. Who reached this point? Whoever did, you are the best. Please give us a like before you leave so we can know how many of you made it to the end. And don't forget, if you have any questions or something puzzling you, write it down in the comments under the video so we can answer it. Peace.